Go ahead and share the screen to start. All right. Go ahead and pull up our checklist. All right. So yesterday you were supposed to have completed the biogeochemical quiz, and I think a majority of you guys did. There were a few of you who did not. I know some of you guys did reach out to me and you communicated issues that you have with the quiz, and that's fine. That happens. But some of you guys just flat out didn't do it. And let me tell you, that is not a good look. That is not going to help you when you're catching zeros for quizzes because we really don't have that many of them. I was really happy with the quizzes. Hold on, let me the quiz average, I think, for the class was like an 84, right? And I think that's pretty good. I will go over the quiz, but I'm going to hold off since I reopened the quiz for those of you that did not finish it. For those of you that did not do it on time and did not communicate with me, there will be a 10-point penalty, and it's still due tonight by 11:45 p.m. Now, let's take a look at what we got going on today. I'm going to go over primary productivity. And we'll go over the TQ 1.8, but I'm going to hold off on going over the quiz until everyone's completed it. And then I'm going to talk to you guys today about food webs and trophic levels, right? And how energy flows from these primary producers. And, you know, how does the energy that's left over to the net primary productivity, how does it flow and cycle through an ecosystem? You guys do have some pages to read tonight in chapter 5. Please do that. Do not skip those. And then you've got 3 TQs tonight, 1.9, 1.10, and 1.11. I think all 3 of these topics are so similar and related and interwoven that's why I'm covering all 3 together, and that's why I'm putting all these questions together. Let me remind you that tomorrow we will not have a class Zoom. I will be at the 2A West cross-country regional competition or the race. And this would be a good time for you to finish up your research project, put any finishing touches on it, and then you'll need to submit your final draft in Google Classroom, okay? Don't email it to me, okay? Don't share it with me in my email. You need to submit it in Google Classroom. A lot of different ways to do that. You can attach all kinds of documents, and if it's simply like a link, right, to maybe a YouTube video that you made or like an audio file, then you can simply upload or copy and paste that link into like a comment. All right. So that way I'm not having to dig through my emails. It's just all in one neat organized place. And you can see that there is a rubric on Google Classroom, right? So if you want to take one final look at that to see how I'll be scoring it. Monday is a holiday, right? So we won't have a live Zoom then either. And you can see some updates on things to come. We'll have our presentations on Tuesday. So you need to have your project done and turned in on Friday. And then you can spend some time Friday preparing for your presentation or on Monday, okay? And then on Wednesday of next week, we'll have our first like unit exam, right? They're called progress checks, and they're made up of multiple choice questions. We're not quite ready to start writing about things yet. I don't think you guys have enough environmental background to really put together like some coherent statements quite yet, okay? So we will get to the writing, but that'll be later on in the semester after you have some more experience under your belt. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the warm-up questions to get us started. All right, this is going over what we talked about on Tuesday. There are 6 questions, right? And so I'm gonna give you guys 5 minutes to work on these, all right? And for the love of everything beautiful in this world, y'all need to participate in class. Y'all are killing me, and you're killing yourself, right? And so today will be the last opportunity for you to voluntarily answer before I just start randomly calling on people for participation grades, right? It's driving me a little cuckoo. Let me go ahead and set my timer. Don't be afraid to be wrong. That's probably the most important part of the learning process. I'm wrong all the time. Get some more water. 2.5 more minutes. All right. So would anyone like to volunteer and give me their idea or definition of what exactly gross primary productivity measures?
It measures the amount of carbon.
Yes, in a sense. And I see someone right here saying the rate at which solar energy is captured in sugar molecules during photosynthesis, which is related to carbon, right? Because plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which contains carbon. And in the presence of light, they're able to perform photosynthesis. So they can take the carbon from carbon dioxide and they can fix it or store it temporarily in a carbohydrate. Now, the important thing to realize about gross primary productivity is it's a measure of how much carbon or how much energy is stored or absorbed from the environment by producers over an area in a given period of time. Okay. So the given period of time and area is important as well. So when considering the units of measurement, right, you'll see usually it's going to be energy, right? Some kind of unit of energy per area, right? Where it be a single plant, a square meter, a hectare, or the entire ecosystem over a given period of time. That could be days, months, years, or decades. Okay. A lot of times you'll see it represented or measured as kilocalories, right? So in this case, we're measuring energy, kilocalories, maybe per square meter per year. Or as Colin had mentioned earlier, sometimes you'll see it represented as grams of carbon, right? Sequestered or stored in a given area, right? Per given period of time. Okay. And the reason that we often report gross primary productivity over a year is because depending on the biome, depending on the climate, gross primary productivity or the rate of photosynthesis that producers are performing fluctuate over the seasons, right? So if you think about our biome, right, we live in a temperate deciduous forest, right? And so deciduous means the plants go through periods of dormancy. They lose their leaves. So if we're thinking about January, right? In January, if we were to measure the gross primary productivity of the forest back here behind Patton, the productivity is going to be really low right now. Most plants don't even have leaves, right? And so they're not going to be photosynthesizing. Now, as spring approaches, the days will get longer, it'll get a little warmer, and the plants will start to grow their leaves again, and productivity will pick back up. And then as we approach summer, we have the longest periods of time. It's nice and warm, it's nice and moist and wet, a lot of humidity. The plants are really happy. They'll kind of reach a peak primary productivity. And then as we approach fall, the days will get shorter, it gets cooler, it even gets drier around here. October and November tend to be our driest months. And then the plants eventually lose their leaves, and then we're back in winter, right? And so this would be our, if we were to measure primary productivity, right, the amount of energy being fixed in a given area over a given period of time, this would look like over the year. Other biomes, right, their gross primary productivity might not fluctuate as much. A tropical rainforest, for example, tropical climates, especially as you get closer to the equator, the amount of daylight and the length of day and night are the same, or they're equal at the equator, and so there's not a lot of seasons. There's not a seasonal change, and so tropical rainforest, right? You'll see if you were measuring gross primary productivity over the year, it's not going to change much, right? There's going to be some small little fluctuations here, right? But there's going to be very little change in gross primary productivity. The plants are not going in any states of dormancy. They're going to be photosynthesizing at a pretty stable rate throughout the year. Okay. Now, talking about photosynthesis, right? What exactly is photosynthesis? Can anyone tell me? I see some people throwing the equation out there. Yep. When plants take in sunlight to make their own food. And I see a lot of you guys already including the chemical equation. It's very important to recognize the significance of photosynthesis and the equation, right? And so plants take in carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide gas. They take it through small openings in the bottom of their leaves, right? And the carbon dioxide acts as a source of carbon, right? It's where they're getting their carbon from. And they need water, right? They get water through their roots. Water vapor can also enter through those tiny holes in the bottom of the leaves. Water is really important because it provides electrons, right? It provides something that helps drive or energize these chemical reactions that are going to fix carbon into a sugar. And then we tend to not include light right here because light is not a chemical. It's a form of electromagnetic radiation. It's energy, right? And the photons from the sun, the light energy, is what catalyzes or excites the electrons provided by water and kind of mobilizes them and allows them to help fix carbon into glucose, right? And so when we fix carbon into glucose, we're making a monosaccharide. It's a small, simple sugar, C6H12O6. This is the chemical formula for carbohydrates, for glucose. And then we produce some molecular oxygen, some diatomic oxygen, as a waste product. Okay, and that's really good, right? So a majority of the oxygen in the air that you breathe was actually produced through photosynthesis. A lot of the air that you breathe right now was produced by the coniferous trees in the boreal forests of like northern North America, right? And also parts of Eurasia, and as well as the photosynthetic phytoplankton in the oceans, right? The oceans produce a lot of oxygen for us through photosynthesis. Now, what about respiration? Okay. Anyone give me like a simple definition for respiration? Yeah, Catherine, I like that, right? You really can't get any more simple, right? So thank you. Cells breaking down sugar into energy, right? And so photosynthesis takes energy from the environment and stores it, right? It stores the energy here, right, in our glucose and sugar, right? So the plant's like, okay, I'm going to get some energy from the sun. I'm going to store it in a sugar. And then there'll come a time where the plant needs that energy. Okay. And so it's going to need to break down the sugar to get the energy for the plant to grow, to synthesize proteins, or to, change direction to kind of follow the sun. And then we perform respiration as well, right? So when we eat sugar, right, when I eat a piece of fruit, my body is going to digest it, and then my cells are going to break down the sugars to release the energy. And so let's take a look at that chemical equation. It's pretty much photosynthesis backwards, right? And so we need the sugar, right? And our bodies can store energy for a longer period of time in fats or lipids, and lipids can be broken down into glucose molecules as well. So we've got our glucose molecule here, and we need oxygen. Oxygen is going to allow our cells to produce the most energy possible, right? More oxygen, we can get more energy out of the sugars. If we don't have oxygen, that's anaerobic respiration, and we're not going to produce as much energy. Humans are not really well adapted for anaerobic respiration. That's why that's why we need to breathe. And then when we break down the glucose, right, we're going to end up with carbon dioxide. So it's a waste gas that we exhale. And believe it or not, every time you exhale, you're actually losing weight, you're losing mass. And we are going to produce some waste water, which we're going to excrete, whether through sweat, transpiration in our breath, or we'll urinate or defecate out the excess water. And then we're going to release some energy. Okay. We're going to release energy. And the energy that is released is usually captured and transferred to a molecule known as ATP. And we'll talk about that when you take biology. And for those of you who have already had biology, you know all about it. All right, so let's go on to the next. Let's go on to the next question. I got to move my little chat box. What in the world is net primary productivity, and what does it measure, right? Yes, I like this. Mary, the leftover energy, and she gave me the equation. Kaylee, energy that has been stored after some has been used, right? And Jessica, yeah, leftover sugar after some has been used. So it's what's left over. Gross primary productivity is the total, right? So how much sugar did the plant make in a given area over a given period of time? And then net primary productivity is how much of that sugar was actually stored and not used during that time period. And so the equation is really important, right? So we have the total amount of energy fixed, right? Whereas Colin pointed out, sometimes we measure it as grams of carbon, right? We're kind of looking at glucose here. You know, how much energy was fixed, right? And then we want to take into account, well, the plant's going to break down some of those sugars, right? And release the carbon in the atmosphere. So we have to take into account how much sugar was used, right? That's respiration. And then what we're left over with is net primary productivity. And I'm going to give you an example today of the power of understanding and being able to calculate net primary productivity. It's really, really important, and it can be impactful for conservation efforts. What units? The same units that we were using before, right? It's going to be some unit of energy, right, in a given area per year. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this next question right here. What two environmental factors would be good indicators of high gross primary productivity and net primary productivity? So think back to my example up here, right? I was comparing the gross primary productivity of two biomes, right? This was the temperate deciduous forest, and this was the tropical rainforest. Yeah, Austin, absolutely. Yep. So Austin says high average temperature and rainfall, and then Mackenzie followed him up by saying climate, right? So climate, right? When we measure climate, climate is, you know, kind of a long view or a long-term view of both temperature and precipitation, right? And so temperature, right, is a good indicator of productivity, right? Because photosynthesis is a temperature-dependent chemical reaction. Like I was saying here, in our biome right now, because of the shorter, cooler days, most plants are dormant right now, right? Deciduous. So the temperature has driven them to drop their leaves and to stop photosynthesis entirely. And then rainfall, right? So precipitation. Some plants go into a state of dormancy, not because of temperature, but more importantly, because of lack of available rainfall. Okay. There are some other things, right? So how much light does the particular ecosystem get? Right? So obviously light can be affected by lots of things, right? So if you think about tropical rainforests being at the equator, you know, they get 12 hours of sunlight every single day of the year. We can't say the same here, right? Living, you know, a higher latitude, you know, there are days of our year that we have way less than 12 hours, right? And, you know, in the winter, it gets dark so early. And then there's days in the summer where the sun doesn't set until like 9 o'clock, right? And the further north you go, the further those extremes between night and day from the seasons. So the amount of light can affect it. And then eventually nutrients, you know, for plants like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, right? The availability of these three can drive or uh, limit gross primary productivity. Now let's look at this next question right here. What might two ecosystems have, or sorry, why, I should have, why might two ecosystems have similar GPPs but different NPPs? So what if we have, you know what? You're the first person to suggest that, Jessica, and that very well could be a cause. And she says different amount of consumers, right? So maybe there is a relative abundance of herbivores in one ecosystem. So the plants are constantly having to expend energy to repair damaged tissues. When plants are grazed, right, they have to replace the damaged tissues. So that very well could be, right? So maybe one ecosystem has lots of herbivores and they're putting a lot of pressure on the plants, right? So although they're both performing the same amount of photosynthesis, the one ecosystem that has a lot of predator pressure, right? A lot of herbivores, and yes, herbivores are kind of technically predators for the prey, in this case plants, to replace the damaged tissues. Yeah, and Mackenzie, that's the best, like the most simple definition. So Jessica's saying these consumers are putting pressure on the plants, and that pressure results in a lower NPP because the plants are performing more cellular respiration. So they're having to consume more of the sugars. It could be, So, Jayla says, what if there's just lots of plants and fewer animals, right? And that would have a result in a lot of net primary productivity because the plants would be able to store more sugar because they're not being fed on constantly. So yes, it all comes down to a difference in respiration. And this could be from, as Jessica and Jayla pointed out, herbivore pressure, right? It could also be disease, right? So if a disease is making its way through a particular plant population, obviously the plants are going to be, expending a lot of the sugars through cellular respiration to provide energy for their immune systems. Now, plants have immune systems, they get sick, a little different than us, but again, it's still going to be energetically costly for those plants as well. Or maybe just a weird fluctuation, an abnormally cool year or dry year, maybe a natural disaster. Maybe one ecosystem experienced hurricane, wildfire, who knows? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and quickly go over 1.8. Let's see here. No, that's not what I want to do. I got to sign in again. And like I said, I'll go over the quiz once everyone's completed it. I was happy, I think it was like 27 out of 32 was like the average, which I think comes out to somewhere in the mid 80s, if I'm not mistaken. All right, let's look at 1.8, which dealt with primary productivity. Okay, so gross primary productivity, as we pointed out earlier, is the total amount of energy, right, absorbed, right, or captured by producers through photosynthesis over a period of time. And if you really want to be specific, you'd also have to include like, maybe a unit of area or the number of plants, perhaps. Net primary productivity is how much energy is fixed, and then we have to subtract the amount of energy that was used through respiration for that given period of time to figure out how much is actually left over. So C is the best answer. And the last one here, we've got two ecosystems, ecosystem A, ecosystem B. Forest A, you can see that the net primary productivity, the amount of energy left over, right, after respiration was taken into consideration was far higher than ecosystem B, right? And so ecosystem A clearly had less respiration or experienced less respiration than forest B. Again, maybe B had more herbivore pressure, maybe a migrating group of organisms that normally doesn't land in that area did and ate a lot of the plant matter. Maybe it's disease, maybe there was a wildfire. There's just pressure here that drove those plants to use, right, to break down more of those sugars than to store them. And it could also just be the types of plants. Some plants, they're just, like kudzu, for example, is going to have probably a pretty low net primary productivity because it's constantly growing. Whereas some plants, will be storing, vegetation or storing energy for longer periods of time as a form of biomass. Like a large fig tree in the tropical rainforest would have an incredibly high net primary productivity. despite producing all those figs. All right, let me dive into our lesson. Actually, before I do this, and I know some of you guys who have had biology and other sciences before, this is going to be like, you know, beat a dead horse. But it became apparent when I was looking at y'all's biogeochemical cycle quiz that quite a few of you guys don't necessarily fully understand pH. Okay, and it is something that I hope, but I guess I'm wrong in expecting that to be something that you guys learned in middle school or elementary school. It's a pretty simple scientific concept, but it seems like some of you guys don't necessarily fully wrap your mind around it. So what exactly is pH? Okay, pH, we measure the pH of solutions, right? You can even measure pH of like soils as well, but really you're looking at, well, I'll get there in just a second. When we measure pH and we're discussing pH, we're really discussing, how acidic something might be, right? Or it might be neutral, right? Something like pure water is a good example of something that would have a pH that would be neutral. Or it could be how basic something is or how alkaline something is. So basic, I like to use the term alkaline, right? So they kind of mean the same thing, right? And we measure this on a scale, right? The pH scale goes from 0 all the way to 14, okay? And then 7 is smack dab in the middle. So 7 would be considered a neutral pH. Anything less than 7, right, is acidic. Obviously, the closer you get to 0, the more acidic something is. So this would be a very, very, very strong acid, right? Whereas something with a pH of 6 would be a weak acid. The further you go over 7, the more basic or more alkaline something is. So this would be a very, very strong base with a pH of 14. And then you can see that something like 8 will be a weak base, right? So very, very weak base or not very alkaline, okay? Now, this scale, right, is based on a logarithmic scale, right? So each number is actually 10 times stronger or weaker than the other. So let me kind of explain this. Now, rainwater, natural rainwater tends to be somewhere between 5 and 6. So let's say we're studying an ecosystem, and historically for the last 75 years, the pH was somewhere around 6, okay? And then they build a coal burning power plant. And as a result of burning coal in the area over the next 20 years, the average pH of the rain drops down to 4, right? It used to be 6 and now it's 4. And you think, big deal, right? It's only gone down by 2, right? No big deal, right? But it is a big deal because 5, right, as we go down each scale, 5 is 10 times as acidic as 6. 4 is 10 times as acidic as 5. So for us to jump all the way from 6 to 4, it's 10 times 10, right? So something with a pH of 4, is 100 times, 10 times 10, right? 100 times more acidic than an initial pH of 6, right? That's serious, right? That's really, really serious, right? Because all organisms have a range of tolerance for pH. I'm actually going to get into that in the next unit 2, and I'll kind of bring up enzymes and all that, right? And the same goes for this side, right? So, something with a pH of 10 is 10 times as acidic as 9. It's 100 times, or no, 10 times as basic or alkaline as 9, and something with a pH of 10 would be 100 times as alkaline or basic as 8, and 1,000 times more basic than something as 7, right? Now, what are we really measuring when we're measuring acids and bases? We all know that if I were to take my hand and place it into a beaker, right, like a glass container, and I said the solution, or the pH of this solution, I said, okay, it's got a pH of 0. You know that if I put my hand in there, that would not be a good day, right? We know that acids can be very reactive, especially with our skin, and I'm going to experience some very, 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 very serious chemical burns, right? And if I had a beaker over here, and you told me that the pH was 14. And if I put my hand in that beaker, I know that I would experience extreme chemical burns, probably at the same degree, right? But they react with different molecules in my skin. They're going to damage my skin in different ways, but they're definitely going to damage my skin. Now, if I put my hand in a beaker of pure water, we know that nothing is going to happen per se, because neutral solutions are not all that chemically reactive. Now, why are strong acids and strong bases so chemically active? Well, pH is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions. And hydrogen ions, H plus, because of the charge, it is very chemically reactive, right? There's lots of hydrogen ions in an acid. And so if they come in contact or get near anything that is negatively charged, they're going to be attracted to it and they're going to react with it, right? So if you put your hand in a strong acid, these hydrogen ions are going to react with any negative molecule in your skin or on your skin, and that's not going to be a good day, okay? Now, there on the other side, on the bases, there's not a lot of hydrogen ions, right? There are very few hydrogen ions in a alkaline solution, right? But it still will react with your hand violently, right? And cause some crazy chemical burns, right? So why is that? Well, because it's not just hydrogen ions floating around in the solution, okay? If we think about water, right? And remember, water is neutral, right? Water has a pH of 7. And the reason it's neutral is because water, H2O, on occasion will break apart, right? It'll separate into the ions that make up water. And when it separates into two ions: hydrogen ions that are positively charged and hydroxide ions that are negatively charged. And in water, these concentrations are equal, right? And so as soon as the water molecule breaks apart or dissociates into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, they will just as quickly join back together, right? And so there's no free floating ions, right? So it's not very reactive. This random dissociation of water, though, is actually what gives water its conductivity, believe it or not, right? The reason why electricity can move through water is because of this random dissociation. So if, right, something like an acid with a pH of 0 has lots of hydrogen ions, what it means is it has very few hydroxide ions, right? And if a solution with a pH of 14, an incredibly strong base, has very few hydrogen ions, it means that it has lots of hydroxide ions. So you can see now why my hand will experience some severe chemical burns or chemical reactions in either of these solutions, right? Because there's a lot of positively charged hydrogen ions in the acid. So anything negative in my skin is going to be attracted, or these positively charged hydrogen ions are going to be attracted, and they're going to cause chemical reactions. Whereas over here in the strong base, there's going to be lots of hydroxide ions. And so that the base will attack anything positive, any positive molecules in and on my skin tissue, okay? So it's really important to understand pH because it's something we're going to talk about over and over and over and over and over again. And there are so many things that we do as people, as a civilization, as a culture, that changes the pH of the environment, right? And this is a very strong determining factor of whether or not an organism will be able to survive, is whether or not they can tolerate that particular pH. Okay, so hopefully you found that helpful, right? Just kind of an introduction of pH. Now, for those of you that have chemistry, you know that it's really not necessarily, oh shoot, how do I get out of this? It's really not all that simple. I mean, it is and it isn't, okay? But what I just went over is probably enough to get you through this environmental class. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about today, we're gonna talk about trophic levels, right? So the different levels in which energy passes. And, as energy passes from one trophic level to the next, we know there's gonna be a constant loss of heat, right? There's also gonna be a constant loss of energy through respiration, right? And so the plant was gonna take energy from the sun, right, through photosynthesis. We have our gross primary productivity, right? But then the plant is going to use some of that energy through respiration, and it's going to lose some of that energy as heat. And so it's only the net primary productivity that's available to our little nugget right here, our little friend, right? Our little caterpillar. And then the caterpillar is going to use some of that energy immediately, and it's going to lose some energy as heat to the environment. And so only some of that energy will be fixed into the caterpillar's tissue, and that'll be available to the next level, the next consumer, in this case, the secondary consumer, right? So this bird is going to consume this caterpillar. It's going to use some of that energy immediately, right, through respiration. It's going to lose some of that energy as heat. Birds are endothermic, just like us. They're warm-blooded animals. In fact, their average internal temperature is sometimes are higher than ours, so they spend a lot of energy just maintaining that internal temperature. And then some of that energy is going to be fixed into their tissues, right, stored as glycogen in their muscles or fat tissue or oils, waxes. And then this bird gets eaten by an apex predator. And this apex predator is then going to assimilate some of that tissue into its own body tissues. It's also going to use some energy for respiration. It's also going to be excreting waste. It's also going to be losing energy as heat to the environment. And when any of these organisms die, right, or any of these organisms excrete any kind of waste or lose organic matter, birds do lose their feathers and grow new feathers, and insects do molt, right? The decomposers and detritivores are going to, have access to that biomass and to that nutrient. And they're also going to use respiration, right? So they're also going to be losing some energy, and they're also going to lose some energy as heat. So you can see it's a very inefficient system, a lot of loss of heat, right, to the environment. Now, what does this mean for us, right? Well, this typically means because there's so much loss of heat and energy as we go from one level to the next, we tend to need more producers, right, to support consumers, right? So if you go into the tropical rainforest and I said, count all the plants, it's going to be a dizzyingly difficult task that might take your entire lifetime to count all those plants, because all of those plants are needed to support the primary consumers, right? Because again, there's going to be some loss of energy as we go from one level to the next. And we get this pyramid shape, right? This pyramidal shape because there's so much loss of energy that only so few carnivores or apex predators can be supported by a substantial amount of producers, right? So the number of apex predators is determined by the secondary consumers, the number of secondary consumers determined by the primary consumers, and then eventually by the producers because of that inefficient flow of energy. Well, how inefficient is it? Well, we can kind of follow what is known as like the rule of 10, right? And it's an approximation, right? And so it's not an exact number per se, because depending on the ecosystem, depending on the biome or the food web, the amount of energy that actually does get transferred from one level to the next could differ. It could vary. But there is a safe assumption here that as we go from one trophic level to the next, right, we are going to see a transfer of 10% of energy, right? So if there are 10,000 kilocalories of energy available, right, and net primary productivity for this hectare per year, then 10% of that will be assimilated into our primary consumer population. So there's a lot of loss, right? Again, the plants and the animals, they're all going to be performing respiration, so that uses energy, and there's going to be a loss of heat. And so we lose 90% of the energy at every trophic level. And this is actually something you'll study in chemistry known as entropy, right? Like our systems are constantly moving into a more and more disordered state. And when the rabbits are eaten by the snakes, right, the snakes are going to take some of that energy, 10% again, and assimilate it into their tissue. And again, we see another 90% loss. And again, this is an approximation. This is an average, right? So in some ecosystems, it might be higher than 10%. Some it might be lower. And then when the eagle eats the snake, again, it's going to assimilate 10% of that energy or that biomass, right? So you can think about this in kilocalories or grams of carbon or kilograms, right? And we have 90% loss, okay? And so you can see that kind of pyramid again, right? You need to have a lot of energy at the bottom to support the caloric needs of our apex predators. And so you can see how it's gone down each time. What's really, really neat about this is we can use this for conservation efforts. Let's say that this is a American bald eagle, and this is the female, right? Because the females don't have that like white cap. And so obviously if we're trying to protect the American bald eagle, and maybe we're trying to create a conservation area, like how much area do I need to set aside for a breeding pair of bald eagles? Well, so let's say one eagle, right? One eagle needs, let's say 10, and this is like a ridiculous example, but let's say this bald eagle needs, 10 kilocalories a day, right? And guys, that is not a lot, right? A kilocalorie is the same as like capital C calorie. It's like kind of how you talk about food. You're definitely needing more than 10 calories a day, especially for a bird. But let's just pretend, right? And if we're trying to protect two, right, it would be times two, right? So to support our mating pair of bald eagles for the day, we need 20 kilocalories of energy per day to keep the mating pair alive. Well, let's just pretend like the bald eagles are only eating snakes, right? So how many kilocalories of snake meat, right? How many kilocalories of snake meat do we need to support our mating pair of bald eagles? Well, you have to remember that only 10% of it, right, actually gets assimilated into this bald eagle's tissue, right? And so 20 kilocalories is 10% of what number? Anybody?
200.
Yeah, yeah, right. And so we need 200 kilocalories of snake meat a day. Again, this is a ridiculous example, but you'll get the point here in just a second, right? And so we can take it down further. Well, if we need to support 200 kilocalories of snake meat a day, how many rabbits do we need, right? And again, it's 10%. And so that would be 2,000 kilocalories, okay, of rabbit meat per day to support the snakes that support the bald eagles. And then, well, how many plants, right? How much plant biomass do we need? How much kilocalories in plants do we need? Well, 2,000, right, is, 10% of 20,000, right, kilocalories per day. Now, again, you're like, well, Mr. Collins, what do I do with this number, right? Well, with net primary productivity, because net primary productivity tells us, kilocalories, per square meter per year. If I know how much, plant energy I need per day, I can multiply that by 365, and that'll give me the amount of kilocalories I need in a year, right? And then I can use that with the value for net primary productivity to figure out the area. And then I can say, okay, to support 2 mating bald eagles, we need 5 hectares of temperate deciduous forest, right? And it's an approximation, but this is a great way to mathematically and to numerically calculate conservation areas, because again, math is powerful. People understand numbers, right? And we can use these numbers to produce scientifically backed data-driven decisions. So you don't just like, well, I think 5 acres is enough, right? Or, because we look at an acre of land and you're like, yeah, that's plenty for a small little bird, right? But if you don't understand this, that can be a serious misconception, okay? And this applies to the oceans as well. So we can use this idea of 10, right, and the inefficiency in which or the way in which energy transfers from one level to the next, to also apply it to marine ecosystems or aquatic ecosystems. And you can use it for biomass, because again, biomass, right, the mass tissue, is related to how much energy is fixed, right? I mean, if you eat lots of calories, you're going to gain weight because some of those calories, right, some of the energy in the food is going to be stored as fat. Maybe it's going to be used to make muscle, right? And so you can see here that these apex predators need a substantial amount of biomass to support their tissues, to support their caloric needs. And so if we reduce these populations, we can see some serious problems, right? If we reduce the primary producer population, if let's say because of an oil spill, right, there's a reduction in seagrass population by half, right? So what do we do, right? Well, if we're cutting, right, if the population's cut in half, well, I need to make my triangle, right? And so if we only have half the number of producers, I make my triangle like this, what's going to happen, right? Well, we don't even have enough energy. We don't even have enough biomass to support these apex predators. So bye-bye, guys, right? And we're only going to have enough energy to support a very, very small number of these guys, right? And if you know anything about marine fisheries, things like jack, amberjacks, barjacks, and snappers, these are commercially significant. These are important for marine fisheries. And so you could see a significant decline in the amount of fish caught in that area. And now these people don't have a way to support themselves. And it can be very problematic, all because we experienced a loss in seagrass. Okay. And there's another way in which this kind of plays out in nature. And there's another way in which that we've messed with it. Right. And that's known as a trophic cascade. Let me propose a situation for you. What kind of biome do you think this food web belongs to? Anybody? Remember, biomes are biomes because of their climates and because of the plants and animals they have.
A desert.
Yeah, I see a lot of you guys saying desert. That's perfect, right? And so this is like definitely some kind of semi-arid ecosystem. Let's say you own a ranch in Texas or New Mexico or Arizona and you raise beef cattle. And you are sick and tired of losing cattle to rattlesnake bites. So you and your other cowboys, you go around and you get out your shotguns and you shoot and trap and kill every single rattlesnake you come across because you're sick and tired of losing 2 or 3 beef cattle every single year. Well, if you look at this food web, you can see that these arrows represent the flow of energy, the flow of biomass, the flow of nutrients, right? Flow of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of that through this particular ecosystem. And you can see that it's not a simple A is eaten by B, B is eaten by C. It's a very complex food web, right? A lot of interconnected links to this mesh or web, if you will. Now, by removing these rattlesnakes, we may or may not have caused more problems for ourselves. So the first thing you look at is, okay, who relies on the rattlesnake population, right? Well, it looks like this hawk, right, feeds on quite a few of these rattlesnakes. So without these rattlesnakes, the hawk has less food. And more than likely, what we're going to see is a decrease in the hawk population, perhaps. Maybe even the hawks don't find enough food in the area and they migrate elsewhere, right, where their populations die off. Typically, birds just leave an area in search for food rather than just dying off immediately. Now that we have no snakes and now that our hawk population is migrated elsewhere, we're going to see a significant increase in lower trophic levels, right? Since there's no more snakes, what we're going to see is we're going to see a substantial increase in the squirrel population, and the squirrel population is going to go up because no more hawks. The wood rat population is going to increase, as well as the grasshopper mouse. Now, these mice reproduce really quickly, and if they have an abundance of food, then they are going to grow and reproduce, right? And so as their numbers skyrocket, they're going to start to put a lot of pressure on the native plants, and the native plants, their populations are going to decrease as a result of the rodent pressure. Now, as their food becomes more and more scarce, these rodents, they're opportunistic organisms. They're omnivores, so they're going to find food somewhere. And so they end up in your barn, and they end up eating the hay and grain that you have set aside for your cattle as a supplemental feed, maybe for winter or for the drier months, right? And these guys are starting to eat the hay and the grain, and they start nesting in it, and they start defecating and urinating all over it, and some of the grain and hay gets contaminated with some kind of bacteria. And the cattle eat the contaminated hay and end up with a bacterial infection. And since you are a commercial farmer perhaps, and you get lots of beef cattle in a very small area, the bacterial population skyrockets within your cattle population, and every cattle gets infected. And you went from losing 2 or 3 cows a year to snake bites to your entire herd being infected with bacteria. Now, you might be able to treat the infection with antibiotics, but you went from losing 2 to 3 cattle a year, and let's say a beef cattle cost or is worth maybe $1,000 a piece. You lost $2,000, $3,000 a year to the rattlesnakes. Well, now you might be spending thousands of dollars on your herd to negate this infection. And let's say you lose 20% of your herd, right? And these herds are huge, so maybe you lost 20,000 cattle, and you're thinking, are there really ranchers out there that have that many cattle? Oh man, I'm gonna blow the top off your mind when we look at commercial agriculture. So that's $20,000 that you lost, not to mention the amount of money that you'd spend on the antibiotics to treat the remaining animals, right? So you can see how out of control this can get, right? This is called a trophic cascade. It's when apex predators are removed and you see a just wild flux in populations as they scramble to reach equilibrium again. Let me show you a very famous example as we wrap up. Okay, this is a picture of a field that has a creek running through it. ahead and draw a little creek. Okay, there's a creek flowing through here. And this is the same area, right? You can see the little house on the prairie. So this is Yellowstone National Park, right, which kind of sits on the border of Montana and Wyoming, right out west. And this is an American prairie. And you can see in 2002 and in 2015, there's a substantial difference. What is the major difference that you notice in these two photographs?
The plant life.
Yeah, the plant life. There are far fewer plants in 2002 than there are in 2015. Now, these plants in particular are really important. What do we call the plants or the area along the side of a river or stream bed? Special name for these areas. Hold on. Let me check the chat. Yes, Madison. This is the riparian zone. And riparian zones are incredibly important for reducing erosion and assimilating nutrients from runoff before it gets into the streams. So these plants are really important for protecting these freshwater streams and freshwater rivers. Now, why in the world are there more plants in 2015 than there were in 2002? What do you think? Who was probably eating the plants here? Yeah, some kind of herbivores, maybe cows. And in this case, they were elk, right, which are herbivores. And in 2002, the elk population must have been higher. And so the elk, the herbivores, were putting a lot of pressure on these plants, right, eating a lot of the riparian vegetation as they drink water. Now, what do you think happened in 2015? Or what do you think the difference in population is for the elk in 2002 and 2015? Do you think there are more elk or less elk in this 2015? Yeah, a decrease. So we saw a decrease in the elk population. And since there were fewer herbivores, there's less pressure on the riparian zone. And so the plants could grow more readily and it probably has a higher net prior productivity now. Now, why? Why in the world? What do you think was introduced? And I'll give you some like background information. In 1995, something was reintroduced to the Yellowstone National Park, which was actually our first national park and one of the biggest ones. Yeah, Troy hit it right away. Wolves, right? Now, wolves had all been removed from Yellowstone, and around, I think the last wolves were killed and removed in like the 1920s. And what happened, since there were no wolves, there was nothing to keep the elk population in check. And the elk population grew like crazy. And these elk put a lot of pressure on the plants. And the water quality in Yellowstone decreased because as the elk ate all the riparian vegetation, there was more erosion. So you have more sediment getting into the streams, right? And if more sediment's getting into the streams, you're going to have more nitrogen, more phosphorus, more potassium. So you have greater chance for algal blooms, and the water quality decreased. And as the water quality decreased, a lot of the animals that relied on these streams and rivers started to suffer from a lot more infections, right? They were getting sick more often. And so this problem extended to all parts of the food web and just having more erosion in general. And so when they reintroduced the wolves in 1995, the wolves put a lot of pressure on the elk. And so not only did the wolves change the population size, right? Not only did they eat more elk in eating the weaker, younger, or elderly, which strengthened the elk population, reduced it, but strengthened it. They also changed the elk behavior. Most herbivores have like a predator fear behavior, right? You know, elk are not going to be hanging out in the wide open near trees and riparian zones like eating veg, because the wolves can easily surround them, they can see them. And so the elk are hiding now and spending more time up in these higher areas where there's more trees so they can hide. And so their behaviors changed as a result of the reintroduction of the wolves in 1995. And the ecosystem has changed for the better as a result of that. Now you can imagine the resistance to like, do we really want to put wolves back in this ecosystem? It's dangerous for people. We don't want to lose the park. We don't want to lose the number of people that come. But the ecosystem itself was suffering as a result of the removal of the wolves. And that's known as a trophic cascade. You can see it here. Without the wolves, elk populations out of control. They put a lot of pressure on the plants. And you can see that here in the graph. Cottonwood and aspen are very, very important plants for riparian ecosystems and this American prairie. And you can see that as soon as the wolves were removed, their populations were decimated by the elk. You can also see this play out in aquatic ecosystems, right? So maybe this is a freshwater lake, and this particular area had no regulations surrounding fishing. So people were here fishing all the small and big mouth bass, largemouth bass, and they removed them. Well, these bass are like apex predators, right? And so without these bass, these apex predators, the secondary consumer population exploded, and they were eating all the zooplankton, the primary consumers. And since there were no various zooplankton, no primary consumers, there's no one to eat the algae. And so maybe some nitrogen and phosphorus ended up in this ecosystem and you have an algal bloom, right? Whereas in a more balanced ecosystem where you have these apex predators, these populations are held in equilibrium. And so even if we do have an excess amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, sometimes these predators can kind of negate that excess in nutrients. Now, what's eventually going to happen to this situation right here is as the algae runs out of nitrogen and phosphorus, they're going to die, sink to the bottom, they're going to decompose. The bacteria are going to break them down, they're going to consume all the oxygen. And then these fish right here are not going to have enough oxygen to survive, so they will die. And then you'll see a huge explosion in zooplankton because they no longer have those predator populations if they can tolerate those hypoxic conditions, and they might eat all the algae, and then you have an entire collapse, right? So it can get out of hand really quickly. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. Do not forget to go and do your TQs 9, 10, and 11 tonight. And for those of you that didn't do the quiz, shame on you. There's a 10-point penalty for not completing it on time, but it is open till 11:45 p.m. tonight to complete. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you for participating a little bit more via the chat, but it would be so much better if you guys just vocalized your thoughts. So I don't have to like go back and forth between the chat. All right, we'll work on it. But it was a little better today. Thank you guys. Remember, no Zoom tomorrow, and Monday is a holiday.